Evolving barbaric hieroglyphs, I spit my gifts, shift your surface with vernacular skill. The rawest live, touching down like meteors, none other than black gods. Stones in my timepiece coming from black stars. Negativity for keep far away from doors. Single-mindedly destroying the ops and the odds. Just another warrior's quest. The past may get rest. Demons coming for my crown, get beheaded like the next. These blessings never threats, just to verbalize a message, catching energies of critics. All the Atari get deaded. Pray I stay alert on the field, be skillmatic in anything my enemies deal. Be dead actions, I proceed just like I lead beneath it. So many seas to win. It's our time to align stars. So spirits lead. Who could war with me? Catastrophically or audibly, given no choice by God's law. I'm Lucifer on streets.
Let me start by turn the camera on here. Start by introducing myself. For the Chairman Robert Ward, National Chief of Staff of People's Black Panther Party and Chairman of the San Diego Black Panther Party. What we do here is basically every other week we try to give a political education class to the public, just on the strength of some things that we feel is very important as Panthers to let the community know and be aware of as it applies to our growth and development and building within the Black Power movement and the Black Power struggle, as well as just some information that can be applied across the board with humanity, and especially as it applies to dysfunctionality. The subject matter we're gonna be covering tonight is some of it is generalized in terms of just human behavior and social engineering that takes place with us, and then a lot of it is geared down toward what we strive and deal with as Black people specifically. But in saying that, it's important that we recognize that there is a lot of different angles of information that information can come from within a community. So when we do our political education class, a lot of it is not just geared toward introducing you to the Panther Party, but it's geared toward, when we refer to political education, it's geared toward the things that we know the community needs to know. And as Panthers, we view all types of things as basically political education, because political education deals with self-governance as well as family and community. And starting this topic off, we'll dive a little bit more into that. So let me go ahead and share the screen. And at certain points, I'll pause and give people an opportunity to ask a few questions before we move on. All right, can first off confirm y'all can see the screen? Someone?
Yes,
we see it, sir.
Good. Got it. All right, let me expand this a little bit. All right, so let me start off by saying tonight's subject is the oppressive impact of highly complex symbolism. Now, when we say complex symbolism, we talk about the things that most people tend to take for granted as it applies to the things that bombard you on a day-to-day basis, to the point to where a lot of times we have been numb to the effects of it, in terms of just outright recognizing how these prolonged things that we constantly be exposed to have what they do to condition us as a people and as individuals, and how they play an important impact on how we think, and from a psychological perspective, prohibit us from being strong visionaries and organizers, as well as just having the audacity and the willpower to move forward and move things to a higher level as individuals, family, and the community. So in saying that, a lot of times we refer and teach the people and the public on what we refer to as the trifactors. There are a lot of things in terms of symbology that goes into the trifactors. For instance, the Black Panther Party and most of the Panther formations have within their local objectives what they call the 3Ds. The 3Ds is define, develop, and defend. And these are just basic aspects or approaches that, when it comes to critical thinking, that we deal with across the board as Panthers when we approach subject matter. As a people, you must be able to define who you are versus allowing your enemy to define you, or as something external to define you. Then with that being stated, you have to be able to develop what you have defined in terms of your progression forward. And then as that is defined and developed, you must be able to defend it, which rolls right back into the definition and the recalibration. And this is supposed to take place with each and every generation. So those three D's also represents elements of the trifactor. Today, I want to expose you to another concept within the trifactor, which most of y'all are familiar with in terms of hearing these from a cliche perspective, but I just want to dive a little bit deeper and make sure you recognize from a symbolic perspective, the symbolism behind it. And that is the first one, the trifactors of the K's or the knows, is to know yourself. And oftentimes we hear it referred to as know thyself. One of the biggest elements and the biggest situations in regards to knowing yourself is most people are not aware of how far stretched that goes. Within knowing yourself, there's three elements or three trifactors that go into, which is the physical, mental, and spiritual. You must be able to have adequate knowledge of yourself as it is told by your people as it applies to that. So then when you deal with knowing yourself, that's only 1/3 of the fight. You must also know your enemy. The next one is you must also know your environment. One thing about knowing your environment that a lot of people tend to take for granted is that knowing your environment also deals with another set of trifactors, which is past, present, and future. Those three things go into knowing your environment because at any given time within your environment, you are looking at things through the perspective of the past, present, or the future. And based upon your ability to recognize and analyze things within those three elements of the trifactor, past, present, and future, it has to do with how you engage with your environment. So when we talk about knowing your environment, it's not as simple as simply recognizing that, okay, it is hot outside or I'm in such and such city, but it's being able to see things from a broader perspective as it applies to being able to build and contribute to your liberation as a people. Because again, within that element of the trifactor, if you are not able to gauge your environment, then you're not going to be equipped to be able to recognize what it takes to add to your environment. So therefore, if you are not able to see the past, present, and future as it applies to the condition and environment that you operate from, you will also not be able to know your enemy because your enemy will operate through levels of cloak and invisibility as it applies to your recognition of how to identify the enemy. If you're not able to recognize and operate within your environment, you will not be able to deal with your enemy. And from that same standpoint, if you're not able to deal with your enemy and recognize what your enemy is based upon the environment that you operate from and the limitations within an environment you operate from, then that leads into or bleeds into your ability to know yourself. So therefore, you would not be able to know yourself. So all three of these things work together in unison and in harmony. And as it applies to the trifactor, we must recognize that another element of the trifecta dealing with individual, family, and community or collective, individual, family, or collective. All three must equally be given the same level of strength or the same level of growth or the same level of attention. The problem we find ourselves facing, especially as a collective body, is that too often we are lopsided in our ability to recognize that we must deal with things as a trifactor equally across the board. Too many times people focus on when they refer to as a family, they think of just simply my spouse and my children as my family, not recognizing that the connection between that must extend into your community in order for it to be a bona fide or a productive family. Because in essence, what your family is doing is dealing with what the Panther Party call continuity. Continuity is moving into the plane of the next generation, which also again feeds right back into knowing your environment, which gets you the recognition of recognizing past, present, and future as it applies to the generation. That also goes into the trifactor of the young, the middle, and the elder class. So when you're talking about knowing yourself and you talk about knowing the different three dynamics as it applies to the age groups, you have to be able to have a connection with your elders, a connection with the middle generation, and connection with the youth. And having those connections and making that type of approach gives you the ability to deal with knowing yourself as it applies to the physical, mental, and the spiritual apparatus. Another element within this trifecta that we're talking about, just to add a new layer of dimension, if I'm not sure if y'all can see how I move my cursor, but across from know thyself or know yourself, you have creator. Because if you are in control of who you are, knowing yourself, operating through, again, referring to the 3Ds, define, develop, and defend, you recognize that you are the creator and the sole provider of your situation as it applies to you as an individual, which moves into the family, which moves into the collective. So from that standpoint, the other element within that same trifecta is creator. Now, bringing this onto a higher level of awareness, that goes into the coup, which again, as we go down the ladder, we will see that's the Ku Klux Klan. A lot of people don't recognize the elements of that organization in terms of certain mentalities that they have as it applies to psychology and spirituality within the framework of that organization. So creator sits at the middle with the pillar of know yourself and the coup. Know your enemy, destroyer. Your enemy is typically viewed as form as destroyer, which is the opposite of the creation. From that standpoint of it is the opposite of where you're going, which also falls into the concept of a klux. So the destroyer is the klux. Now, knowing your environment, again, if you are able to recognize past, present, and future, mineral, water, and air from that aspect of the trifecta, then you are dealing with the preservation. You're dealing with the preservation of life. You're dealing with the preservation of your future. You're dealing with the preservation of how you face the current situation, as well as being able to pull and extract from the past, which again goes into the concept of culture as well as it applies to bringing together the individual, the family, and the collective. And therefore, that forms what's referred to as a clan, which are can be viewed as a tribe. So giving y'all this beginning overview and concept of the trifecta, it was just basically a way of letting you know the idea of what we're getting at when we talk about the impact of high complex symbolism, because most people are familiar or heard of the concept of the trifecta or the Trinity. Let's just break it down from that standpoint, the Trinity, but we've only thought about it from a religious, oftentimes a oppressive religious point of view or perspective, not recognizing that symbology on a higher level controls and dives into how we think. And by controlling our perception, which is what we get into next, it determines your altitude to be able to advance and be a visionary and move forward throughout life. Before I move forward, does anybody got any quick question about that concept they would like to ask? Okay, and I keep going. All right, reading here, our advancement must be made with practical applications and approaches that are geared toward identifying problems and weak points, then build solutions to bridge upon the next level of advancement. Why that's important and why I have to say that is because sometimes I think we put the cart before the horse as it applies to how we should be approaching revolution. And in saying that, too often we find people jump into extreme measures of what type of work they should be engaging in without dealing with the basics. This is why some of the political education classes we cover, like this one in particular, kind of goes into the individual psychology that different people need to basically recognize in order to come together as a collective. This goes into the fact that this is why it is hard for us as a people to be able to collectively come together and refer to our specific types of tribes as we talk about Black people in terms of us in in the United States here, America. So from that standpoint, as we recognize our dysfunctionalities as individuals and our approaches, and then start recognizing how we have been torn apart through forms of domestication as a people, it helps us to be able to move past the individual differences that we oftentimes are unconsciously using against one another to be able to organize on a massive level, as well as remove the blockages that take place that cause us to not be able to be original thinkers and visionaries. That's why we refer to within the Black Panther Party, People's Black Panther Party, the concept of the 3Ds, again, to be able to define who you are, develop who you are, and then defend that. And when we talk about defense from that standpoint, that goes into another concept of what I just talked about with the trifactor, which is define, develop, and defend as it goes into mental, physical, and spiritual defense. So that is another element within the element of the trifactor. So as we advance as a collective, we must be able to take a step back and recognize when we have flaws. And in addressing those flaws, it makes it a lot easier for us to move forward as a people. So part of the key to moving on this path is the ability to recognize symbols and patterns and how these play a role on conditioning our perception. By shaping the way a person thinks, you control what they think. That's important. Once you control what they think, you are in control of what they don't think. And let me stop and state and deal with that, because a lot of times we do not recognize that. Is that by, again, shaping the way a person thinks, it causes you to be able to control what they think. And if I'm in control of what you're thinking, that automatically puts me at an advantage in terms of what you don't think about. And when I focus in on what you don't think about, that's when you really start seeing why it is easy to be able to hold the masses at bay in terms of them really being able to gain a foothold on just being able to synchronize with one another on a collective thought just to move to the next level of any form of liberation, because they are able to, when I say they, when I'm talking about social engineers, are able to control what we don't think about. And too often as people, we do not think of things from that point of view, where we have tunnel vision and we often just run into something simply because we have the willingness to want to be involved, not knowing that just because you want to be involved in grassroots, just because you want to be involved in helping to liberate your people or educate your people or raise the consciousness of the people, don't mean that you're properly equipped for that battle. We have to look at the situation for what it is. We are at war as a people, whether it be through our individuals, at war with our individual selves, at war through our families, or at war through the environment or the oppressive conditions that we operate from. Recognizing that we are at war, that automatically means that you need to suit up as a soldier or a warrior within a war. If you are not educating yourself, if you're not studying, if you're not planning how you want to maneuver on the battlefield of life, then you are, just because you're willing to jump out there, is not going to do anything in terms of moving us forward. What happens at that point is we end up making steps forward and steps back, and each generation forgets or does not build upon the foundation of what the previous generation accomplished, and tends to also undermine what the previous generations have accomplished. So then the newer generations that are moving in oftentimes literally just bulldozer the mental, physical, and spiritual gains that were made by the previous generations. This is why we talked about within a trifactor of know thyself or know yourself, it's important to connect the bridges between the elder generations, the middle generations, and the youth. Because when those connections are not made, each generation of people will run over, bulldozer, or take for granted, or basically eradicate what they are doing, or the contributions that each generational class has to offer. And that in itself forms a type of weapon that is able to be used against the masses of people, whether we talk about black, white, or whatever, all the time. And because most of us don't study psychology from the standpoint of a warrior, we fail to see the importance of how this comes together. So again, moving forward, when I talked about here being in control of what you don't think, them being in control of what you don't think, this grants them, or should I say you, the power to manipulate the power in others. Now, let me explain that. When we say to manipulate the power in others, it's basically controlling their level or the depth of consciousness. And even when people, a lot of times we see folks jump on YouTube and start spitting certain things in terms of revealing, so to speak, a lot of the conditional problems that we face as a people. If it's not provided to you from an application point of view or an application approach, then what are you doing? What can you do with that data? Oftentimes what it does is by simply exposing you to the conditional awareness or the problems, by opening your eyes more so to the environment, should I say, to the environment of what's going on, without providing you knowledge of self and providing you knowledge of your enemy. I'm only exposing you to 1/3 of it. What that often tends to do is cause you to go into what's referred to as a paradoxical lifestyle, or paradoxical or traumatic point of view. And so then on the battlefield, mentally, you jump in a foxhole. You don't shoot, you don't fight, you don't combat, you go into a foxhole mode. Going into foxhole mode is psychologically taking you into a position of survival, or going into position of fight or flight. So we have to be aware of how these things subconsciously can have a adverse effect upon us just simply by being exposed to them without looking at things from a practical application point of view. So this power deprivation will be taught by the victim to their offspring and continue to impede collective vision and mobility. Whether we talk about that from a physical, mental, or spiritual aspect, for generations in perpetual motion. What we mean by perpetual motion as it applies to this is that when social engineers are in control of how you think, what you think, the way you think, and are able to then manifest what you don't think, you tend to naturally, through natural law, teach the same things that have been taught to you subconsciously to your next generation, to your downline. And then they inherit that handicap, they inherit that dysfunctionality, and then they operate from that same mode. Obviously, some of us, are able to break away from these different things and recognize it. But as a collective, most of us are not seeing enough of the patterns, enough of what's really taking place on the battlefield at any given time to be able to form a synchronization of direct action that will put us where we theoretically know we could be as a people being collective. That's what's super important. Any questions before I move on again?
Yes.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I'll wait.
No, go ahead, brother Yanga. You heavy. Go ahead.
Nah, man, I appreciate it. My question was simply this. When you say no, we talking on know yourself. I like, you could elaborate a little more on that, because I think what happens is it's so vague when I agree with know yourself, but know yourself. How do I want to phrase this question? What are they measuring it against? Like, I say know yourself so that you know if you want to participate in the liberation struggle using this platform as your vehicle, using this particular party as your vehicle. Not to say that the self you may discover is wrong. It just may not fit the particular organization or party you're trying to be a part of. So when you say know yourself, what are they measuring it against? Is there a revolutionary type? Should they be looking for something to emerge from the search? or is this just what does that mean to you, Chief?
Thank you for
Thank
that,
you.
because actually I am being vague about that, because my intent here was not necessarily to guide someone, so to speak, to the Panther Party, but make the average person that may be listening to this aware of the fact that to know yourself means that you need to be willing to explore the inner depths of what makes you you. Obviously, that opens up a whole gambit of opportunities, as well as a gambit of the ability to go down the wrong path. But the thing here is recognizing that most people do not take or begin to really take a journey down the inner path of what it means to know thyself. Most people define themselves simply behind their career path, how much money they can put on the table, and whether they can put their children through school so that their children can get a job, and so that their children can add to the capitalistic or imperialistic economy, and so on and so forth. But they're not doing an actual in-depth or reflection, internal reflection, to really see how they've been able to define or started down the journey of defining who they are, and developing who they are and defending who they are. As it applies to me, let me just break that down. When I think about know yourself, I would go back to the transformation of, again, from a physical aspect. To me, that goes into martial science, which means I need to learn how to fully operate my vessel. I need to learn how to fully take care of that vessel. I need to learn how to control that vessel as much as possible, from the standpoint of being able to apply that vessel in the greatest capacity that it can be for the liberation struggle. Now, and when we talk about that from a mental aspect, that goes into the different aspects and studies of science that I need to be aware of as a revolutionary, which goes into studying political consciousness, which we would, from the Black liberation struggle, would go into studying Nkrumah, studying different aspects of Garveyism, and things that would take us to a position of recognizing self-determination, which will feed right back into certain aspects of spirituality, that we would now start looking at things from a historical perspective versus what's been taught to us as a religious and spiritual point of view and path that should take us to a certain form of liberation as it applies to our spirituality, that feeds right back into what we need to do from a liberation standpoint in order to collectively build as a people. But in saying all of that, my aim was really just to get people to be aware of the fact that there is a difference between knowing yourself and simply operating from a what I would refer to as operating from what you've been taught, without actually seeking personal knowledge in your what you have to add to this world.
Yeah. Smoking. War, you doing your thing, man. So I'm sitting back. You were talking a little quick, so let me finish writing. But yeah, I'm sitting back, I'm listening.
This will be reposted on our video. Go ahead, sister.
Okay.
Someone was speaking. All right, let me keep.
Somebody just go ahead, Brother War.
No, I was just gonna keep going if that was it.
Well, I was just in those 3 Ks right there: to know yourself, know your enemy, know your environment. It took me straight to Dr. Amos Wilson's first chapter in the Blueprint to Black Power, and we're talking about consciousness and how vast that is, man. This is Go ahead, brother, because it's just too heavy for me to even expound upon it right now. But I see that connection right there with the whole multifarioususness of the environment, like you say, the toys, and you know where I'm going? Yeah.
Gotcha.
Okay, go ahead, brother.
Gotcha. Appreciate you using the concept of toys, because that's kind of digressing a little bit. But I do want to, at least, since that was mentioned, I want to explain what that acronym means to those that may not be aware of it. Tools of your surroundings. The acronym of TOYS is tools of your surroundings, which actually goes into the elements of knowing your environment as well. when we talk about tools of your surroundings, what that gets into is the fact that anything within that environment that you are not able to identify for your liberation or on your behalf in terms of being able to have it a part of your collective resources, your enemy will in turn use it against you for their resources. And we find ourselves oftentimes not, again, recognizing that we're on a battlefield. And when we don't recognize we're on a battlefield, then we will take our environment for granted, which goes back to the fact that that means that we did not enter that environment with full recognition of our toys. So I say to people all the time, always play with your toys, always bring your toys with you. Let me go on to the next thing here.
What is a toy? How do you identify a toy?
When we say tools of your surroundings, again, this is why it's important to know yourself, because basically any and everything within your environment, just say I'm approaching this again, like I refer to as from a martial science perspective. I'm engaging in a conversation with somebody I don't know. I'm just throwing out a random example, something coming off the top of my head. What direction am I going to be facing as I engage with them that will give me the advantage of identifying their body language, or give me the advantage of crippling them from the standpoint of, depending on where we going with this, that will put me in a position to be able to make sure I am in control utilizing my environment. So therefore, as an example of that, I'm going to make sure I make sure that the sun is behind me facing them. Therefore, their eyesight is being impeded by the sunlight because of the direct sunlight, which also gives me the ability to read them a little bit better, going into neurolinguistic programming, which is the study and the concept of recognizing body language and also being able to pierce into a person's psyche based upon asking certain loaded questions, based upon just how they dress, how they approach you, and so on and so forth, gives you an advantage on the battlefield. And I don't mean to just keep going on and on about, things on a deeper level, but this is why it's important that we're starting with an element of a basis of operation so that we can see how it can keep tiering into higher levels of complexity, which is why we said this is, we're talking about highly complex symbolism. So my position is just to expose you to the fact that there is a lot of tiering, or a lot of, should we say, stories to climb as it applies to dealing with symbolism. So my point was only to expose you to the fact that that is going on and out there. So then as we dive further into the subject matter, it will give you a path to start following. And also, I do want to say this before anybody does jump off, they have to leave. If you text your email in the chat later on, I go through it and I will send you a copy of this document so that you can use it as a basis to continue your study. Let me keep moving here.
Does that coincide with picking and choosing your battles? Is that how it translates?
Well, it can, but now when you talk about that, you're simply talking about what's called the art of war versus knowing your environment. Now you're talking about certain specific strategies or tactics, for instance, that you can apply on the battlefield. So yes, that can be applied, but I'm not even going into that element yet, because that's a whole class. All of these things that I'm talking about can be a breakdown class within itself. So now when you talk about choosing and picking your battles, and then I'm a mention this and I'm gonna move on. That takes it into a trifecta that we call choices, options, and decisions. The difference between knowing what it is to break down a choice versus an option also is your ability to recognize which battles to participate in. Because oftentimes, whether we talk about physical, mental, or spiritual, if a person is a master of psychology, they oftentimes cause you to take on specific fights or specific battles without your overt recognition. So then when we say choose and pick our battles, are we really choosing a battle, or are we operating from the options of battles that have been placed before us because we're not conscious enough to recognize that we have been pushed on a specific battlefield of warfare? And see, as a people, typically most of the fights that we are fighting are reactionary fights, because we're already on a battlefield, we're already in the middle of a situation, and just now recognize it after we've been struck first. See, the bullets are already flying, and for every bullet that you recognize that hits you, then you start forming a defense. Okay, we're not in a neutral zone. We're not in a position to where we are not already getting hit. So therefore, when you talk about choosing and picking a battle, you're being bombarded on all sides already. So yes, choosing and picking a battle, where are you going to begin? So hopefully that at least opened that up for you when as far as that perspective. Okay, let me move on here. A definition here: Black science. Basically any strategy, tactic, or technique used to undermine a person's ability to reason and respond for themselves. Now, when we talk about that, this even goes into the aspect of a hidden concept of mind manipulation. If you think about it, oftentimes Europeans define things that are, they quote unquote black, as something that is evil. Why is it that black is given that type of title in condemnation? So just keep that in mind also as we study ourselves and we study certain materials, is that some of the key words that they are using do not allow those words to basically be repurposed within how you are able to apply and approach those things. So for the sake of just the exposure in terms of how you may go out and search for this and it is applied, one of the ways they call it, one of the things that they refer to it is black science. Another one would be dark psychology from that same standpoint. So be aware of that. And it is real important that I think most people, that if you're not already familiar with it, that you start studying the concepts and different I would say different strategies within dark psychology, because this actually goes into knowing your enemy, and it actually goes into being able to see how your enemy forms certain types of weapons against us as a people, as a family, and as individuals. So I just wanted to give you that starting out. Now, the applications of being able to not only see what certain symbolisms are, but to be able to reverse the controlling effects they have on you is important to eradicate the victim mentality. So what we're going to do now is start going into the concept of victim mentality. Give me just a second. I'm just going to make sure everyone's muted. And if you're not going to ask a question, I just want to make sure you're muted. Okay, and a lot of us on this line may be familiar with the victim mentality, but for those that are not, we want to break it down. So the victim mentality rests on three key beliefs. Now keep this in mind. Again, we started off talking about trifactors. So it is important that you see certain things that line up on that. So within that trifactor here, bad things happen and will keep happening. Other people or circumstances are to blame. Any effort to create change will fail, and there's no point in trying. So these are three concepts that go into beliefs when you're dealing with the victim mentality. One main sign is the lack of accountability. This may involve placing blame elsewhere, no willingness to self-reflect. Now, when we talk about self-reflect, what's important to recognize that no willingness to self-reflect also feeds right back into where we started when we talk about knowing thyself, because most people tend to not necessarily know how to self-reflect, especially if you have been exposed and live out certain types of religious paths that always have you looking outward for your inner being or your inner awareness or your connection to the all, or your connection to universal design. So from that standpoint, you are taught and crystallized from a position of not being able to self-reflect, which goes into placing the blame elsewhere. making excuses, which is sloth and procrastination, not taking responsibility, the renter's mentality, lacking personal ownership. This is important because oftentimes the renter's mentality goes into different areas of how life hits us as a people. So the renter's mentality is not just simply talking about purchasing land or or you know, whether you live in an apartment versus live in a home. It's a mentality. This is why we talk about the renter's mentality. The renter's mentality is, I don't necessarily own anything. I'm only here temporarily. Everything I deal with, whether it be physically, mental, or spiritually, or is not necessarily a part of me. So I don't have any ownership in it. I don't take any stock in it from that aspect. And since I don't, I am not holding myself responsible for what happens. And that goes into one of the key elements of victimization. Reacting to most life hurdles with "it's not my fault," which goes into making the course of life a fault, and therefore not obligated to corrective action. And this is one of the things I do want to say that I see happening a lot of time within spell casting, or what we refer to as the English language on word usage. You hear people use the word fault all the time. Fault, fault, fault. That ain't my fault. My bad. That's your fault. We don't seem to realize that the word fault is being taken out of context when we use it. And it also feeds into victimization. There are plenty of decisions that we make that may have not been the best or most adequate decision. That is not necessarily a fault. So we have to recognize what words we are using and how they play into our demise as victims. Most of us would not necessarily consider ourselves falling for the victim mentality, but there are a lot of things that each and every one of us may find ourselves doing, if we're conscious of it, that will categorize these type of attacks hitting us or bombarding us through subconscious means, putting us in a position of victimization. So this definitely needs to be looked upon at all times. One of the main keys to successful manipulation is to make your target focus on the here and now. Going back to what we talked about earlier, being able to recognize past, present, and future. But now when I cause you to only focus on the here and now, by preventing the past from gaining focus, experience is not taken into account. By preventing future from gaining focus, the consequence of the current action would not be taken into account. By focusing on the here and now in isolation, this is the key. By doing it in isolation, you effectively hypnotize, or AKA crystallize, the ability to critically think. And the longer this instant gratification can hold, the longer the pattern of deception can become a lifestyle. That is the key part here, which goes into why it's important as we deal with the trifecta approach of being on a battlefield, to recognize sequences of events happening past, present, and future. Because too often, and I'm gonna say this as it applies to people that are, you know, those of us that are involved in grassroots and revolutionary action, too often we fall into nostalgianous operations. That is us getting caught in the past and not recognizing how these things prevent our current operations from being able to embed themselves in a future generation, which causes us, from knowing thyself aspect, to not be able to have a proper connection with the elder generation, as us being the middle generation, and therefore the youth don't find your movement or your operation or what you bring to the table to be valid enough to sustain itself and build upon it for their coming into the revolutionary ideology or revolutionary work. So that is super important. Before I move on, anybody got a question about what I've stated? And I realize that some of this is coming fast. This video will be made available on the Panther 48 channel, and you can watch it, you know, over and over. And again, if you leave your information, I will be able to touch base with you on a one-on-one level if necessary. Doc, you got your hand up. Go ahead, sir.
Yes. So, and this might be a bit of a like existential question, but so as far as obviously there is the danger of people becoming focused on the present, but so I've been thinking a lot and seeing a lot. There is also the concern that people aren't in the present at all. We go through our lives and we're thinking about something else. We're daydreaming. We're thinking about what we want to do when we get off work, things like that. So does that just come back to mindfulness and knowledge of self to just pay attention to, well, bearing in mind the past and the present, like where I am right now, or viewing myself as, seeing myself where I am now as a midway point between the present and the future? Or how would you kind of resolve that contradiction between making sure that we're not trapped in the present, but that we're actually here in it as well?
That goes back to in the very beginning when I talked about making sure that we look at things from the a practical approach of application. Because if what we're doing, and let's just take this within a specific framework. Let's just talk about the framework we want to say this from is a revolutionary struggle or fighting oppression, physically, mentally, or spiritually, either category. Now, when I am what you said, daydreaming or being nostalgic or going into the past and just basically building upon the glory of how it was done before me, if that is basically operating as a form of inspiration, then that may be an okay thing. But when it gets to a point to where you are living that operation to the point to where all you do is regurgitate the historical aspects of it, but not the actual physical implementations or practice, then you get into a situation where you're not able to apply it to the future. Give you a good example. Oftentimes, people will talk about how, as African people, we built the pyramids. As African people, we built these fantastic civilizations. We may gloat on the idea or the premise of the fact that, yes, we built those, but are we bringing to the table the knowledge of how this stuff was done? Are we bringing to the table the organization or the operations behind what did it take in order for us to maintain that level of erect structuring, whether it be through mental, physical, or spiritual? So getting caught in the past from a nostalgic standpoint means that you are just simply what I call stargazing on the aspect of what greatness we may have had as a people, but not applying the practical operation of that. So when we think about the past, we need to again recognize we're on the battlefield. So let's just look at this from this position of being on the battlefield. If I'm on a battlefield, that means I am in danger. That means mentally, physically, and spiritually, I can be hit by a projectile mentally, physically, or spiritually, which will take me out of the game. So knowing that everything that I study, everything that I involve myself in needs to be based upon the 3Ds, defining who I am, developing who I am, and defending who I am, or defending my position within my environment, defending my position within knowing what my enemy is and how to address or recognize that enemy and who I am so that I know how to armor myself, which goes back into the defense aspect, so that I can erect or build a foundation that can be built upon, which is what we refer to as foundational generational advancement. Also 3 things: foundational generational advancement. That's another aspect of the trifecta. So hopefully that answered what questions you was having, or give you somewhere to start.
That was very helpful. Thank you.
I got one, Brother Ward.
Yes, sir.
So with this crystallization or this hypnosis, how does one break that hypnosis? Let's say you're the manipulator. How do you break that hypnosis in someone else? If they're crystallized, then therefore they can't project anymore into the future, nor can they reflect into the past, and they're living on the level of a beast at this point. So what do you do about that?
Well, that goes into why we're having this class. Part of that has to be, let's look at it like this. Again, we're on a battlefield. You're dealing with somebody who does not see or is not able to hear, see, or let's just use any of the senses that we have. One of those senses, or all of them, or most of them, are not operated to a position where they are able to detect that it's happening, which means they have been numbed. When we talk about the conditioning of a people, and I believe I gave this class a few weeks ago, so y'all can check out on Panther 48 the psychological conditions. When we deal with the conditioning of a people, we talk about aspects that cause our senses to be numb to what's happening on the battlefield, and by them being numbed or nullified, that goes into what brother is asking me. The way to undo that or work on undoing it, and now let's realize that the undoing process oftentimes will take way longer than it would if someone is just starting out. This is also why it is important for us to reach the youth sooner than later, because the older we get, the more crystallized we get, which goes into our neural net connection, which is how the brain wires itself for its ability to operate and navigate within its environment. So as our brain wires itself a certain way, it is way harder now to undo and reconnect those wirings than it is to form new ones altogether. Okay, so in order to break that, what you must do is you must be able to create a outside condition or outside point of view or perspective or approach that will actually pierce past the numbness. Okay, so in other words, you have to have a different angle of attack, which goes into the idea of the fact that since our people have been manipulated, we oftentimes as organizers, and this is what a lot of people don't like to hear, have to manipulate the people back into not being numb. So we often have to expose them to what's happening from a new direction. That new direction would then hit a neural connection that is not as numb. So therefore, they can feel what's actually taking place. As they feel that, as that connection is formed, it bypasses the ones that have been numbed. So what do we talk about physically, mentally, spiritually? What we're doing now is we're reworking them based upon the conditional things that have already happened to them that cause them to not be able to participate in their liberation, or for them to be going backwards and creating more of a situation for us. Now, let's be realistic about this. This is not obviously going to be the case for everybody. Some people may be too far gone. Some situations may be too far gone. But in general, and let's just approach this from an in general point of view, the best way to deal with somebody that you're trying to reach, again, going into neurolinguistic programming, look at them and see them for where they are at. When you see them for where they are at, you have to be able to operate or synchronize yourself within that environment so that you know how to pierce them in a position that they have not already been numbed. Okay, so it takes psychology. This is why I said that oftentimes when we call ourselves participating in revolutionary struggle for our people, our willingness and our eagerness to just be involved is really not good enough. We have to be students of revolution. We have to be students of psychology. We have to be students of warfare in order for us to recognize, for one, what we're not seeing on the battlefield, which again allows you to be able to be a medic to help somebody else on the battlefield. So look at it from that perspective. I'm on the battlefield and I'm taking on the role of the medic. Every medic still carries a gun, or every medic still is in a position where they're in a line of fire and must be able to fight and strike back while they are protecting or healing or reaching someone else. The better you're able to see things through a position of warfare and apply those concepts to whatever situation you're approaching, the easier it is to come up with different principles that you can apply, that you can live by, to prevent you from having to deal with memorization. See, so my approach here is not for us to memorize specific tactics, but for us to grasp the principles of warfare. And as we grasp the principles of warfare, it makes it to where we are able to have choice over options in terms of what decisions we make on the battlefield. Now, let me move on here. We're still talking about victimization. All right, polarity of defeat, negative talk, and self-sabotage. Now, let me explain that real quick as we move on. Polarity, yin and yang to a certain degree. When we talk about polarity, now we're talking about two, or duality. The duality of this situation that we're talking about now is the self-talk and self-sabotage of a situation. People living with a victim mentality may subliminally internalize the negative message suggested by challenges they face. The impact of symbols aid in this double dose of attack, which is again the negative self-talk and negative self-sabotage. Feeling victimized can contribute to the beliefs such as everything bad happens to me, which we kind of already talked about. I can't do anything about it, so why try? I deserve the bad things that happen to me. No one cares about me. So each new difficulty reinforces these unhelpful ideas until they are firmly embedded in the inner being. This kind of goes back into what Brother Kamu was asking me about, which goes into crystallization. So over time, negative self-talk will damage resilience, making it harder to bounce back from challenges and heal. See, that's the key, is being able to heal. This leads to an adult life of self-pity, and with the advancement of social media platforms, a creation of an altered self removes reality from experience. Let me talk a little bit about that. When we talk about removing reality from experience, see, when we're stuck in survival mode, again, what do we talk about? Physical, mental, spiritual. What we find ourselves doing is we finding ourselves addressing things through cope. And we'll talk about a little bit about this, I think, later on. When we're dealing with coping, within the Panther Party, we have what we call the mechanism structure. Coping is one of the mechanisms we deal with before we are dealing with what we call the living mechanisms. The mechanisms of coping and denial operate as a polarity. The mechanism of coping basically means that when you find yourselves facing an adversity or an obstacle, you figure out a way around it. You figure out a way above it, below it, through it. But what you do not do when you're coping, because you're stuck in survival mode, is remove that obstacle so that the next generation or the next downline does not have to deal with that same damn obstacle. Too often, we jump into situations with the coping mechanism or with the coping aspect and feel like coping is actually defeating the situation. Just because we have learned to cope with something or navigate around it does not mean we have created a solution. Going back to the practical aspects that we talked about in the beginning. So therefore, the application of solutions is not applied when you are coping with something, because coping with it basically means you have learned to deal with it. And maybe it slows you down, but it doesn't stop you. What the problem is the person behind you, it slows them down too. And everybody behind that continues to get slowed down. And if we look at natural law, and let's just take it when we talk about the blood vessels or we talk about the freeway, anytime there's a wreck or anytime there's an obstruction, everything behind that obstruction gets slowed down and magnified, just dealing with basic math. So when you have one person that has a flat tire, now there's a car behind them, they have to slow down. Now, when they slow down, the car behind them slows down even more, so on and so forth. So you create a traffic jam. You create this congestion. That congestion will automatically, through natural law, continue to build up and affect more and more people behind you. Whereas you, knowing that you've already got over this obstacle because you're not applying the trifactor of past, present, and future, you don't look behind because you're moving forward, right? So you're moving forward. You're not looking behind to see that you just caused a traffic jam and slowed down the entire chain. So this is what we're facing with. So it's important in talking about this that we recognize these symbols, because now that I've given y'all a better way to see what's actually happening as it applies to us coping with life, so to speak, as opposed to living life, then we are able to see that this is part of identifying an enemy. Now, this is an enemy of self-design. Okay, so when we talk about an enemy, it's not always an external so to speak, enemy, or the white man, so to speak, if people want to go there. But an enemy could be anything. When we are not aware of thyself or know thyself to a level of degree of where we're on a true path of self-discovery, then the first enemy you're going to be encountering is really your own damn self. And so from that standpoint, if my life is based on coping, then that starts off as me identifying that enemy, because I have to now evaluate, why do I allow myself to continue to cope with life? Why do I allow myself to continue to deal with these conditions of oppression that will not ever change, because I'm not attempting to change them. I'm just simply coping with them. So I didn't mean to get on a tangent, but that was super important to talk about that, which goes into, again, healing. So negative self-talk will go hand in hand with self-sabotage. People who believe their self-talk have an easier time living out the conditions of misery. As the self-talk draws negatives, they unconsciously sabotage attempts they could make to change things or move things towards change. And see, this also goes right inside with earlier when I talked about the perpetual motion that is taught from a generational standpoint, from the current generation to the next generation, based upon living a lifestyle of coping. And so when we talk about that, now we go into what we refer to as the trifactors of victims, which is the betrayal, manipulation, and codependency. Betrayal of trust, especially repeated cycles of betrayal, can also make people feel like victims and make it hard for them to trust anyone. Example: police consent use. Police excessive use of force, harsher sentences for crimes, or lower paying jobs. These are just things that we are used to seeing. These are kind of the things that, as people, sometimes we expect to happen. The problem with that is that betrayal also feeds into part of a victim mentality. Reverse manipulation. This is important because too often we don't see the concept of reverse manipulation. Some who take on victim roles might seem to enjoy blaming others for their problems, for the problems they cause, lashing out, making others feel guilty, or for sympathy or attention. By reversal of acceptance, the target of blame could fall into the trap of forced judgment. The entitlement to curse can implicate measures of power to draw greater separation between capabilities and challenges. Now, let me break that down a little bit. When we talk about basically trapping yourself through the concept of what's referred to as forced judgment, this basically goes into what happens when we settle in or have a level of expectation of things to constantly be bad. And by doing that, what happens then is you draw a greater separation between identifying problems as opposed to symptoms of problems, which also causes you to go on a tangent to not to be able to even go towards the solution, which is why I had to break down coping the way I did. Because too often when we become masters of coping with a situation or masters of dealing with obstacle courses, then we think that we are dealing with it from an approach of solutions. And let me break that down from a physical standpoint. When we are physically engaging in obstacle courses, and you find yourself being able to navigate that obstacle course in just say 10 minutes. And then next thing you know, you got it down to 8 minutes. Now you can jump that, you can climb that rope even faster, and you can swing across the lake even further, or you can swim faster and you got it down to 5 minutes. We find ourselves to be psychologically feeling like we are achieving something because we are able to cope with more, not recognizing that as long as you are still in the mode of coping, as opposed to being able to actually remove that obstacle from your path and from the path of those behind you or before you, then what happens is you are not dealing with solution-based operations. You are simply dealing with addressing the symptom because you're not removing the obstacle. And because you're good at dealing with that obstacle does not mean that the obstacle is, again, is not going to be there for the person that comes behind you. So when we talk about dealing with that, that is what I mean when I say it draws greater separation between capabilities and challenges, because now you are approaching things through the challenge of an obstacle course versus the capabilities of removing certain things from that battlefield or certain things from that obstacle course, so that the obstacle course is less of an obstacle course. So hopefully that made sense to everyone here. Okay,
I
so
got
now
a question, Brother War.
go ahead.
So let's just speak generally collectiveness. If we were to become, or hypothetically, if we was to be a nation within a nation, would that still be coping, or collective coping?
That is a degree of it, but you have to look again. Let's start with the present. We have to start from somewhere. If you're already behind enemy lines, let's just say that we're already behind enemy lines. Do we have a collective base camp? Nope, because our forces right now are operating from a guerrilla perspective, and certain ones of us have more of a fortified a structure to help us to be able to fire back than others. But nonetheless, what type of base camp operation have we set up? And once you set up certain types of base camps, now you could talk about creating a military base or a infrastructure that would allow you to be able to gain more land or gain more capabilities or to gain more freedom. You see what I mean? So we can't approach the situation from a negative position of saying, well, this is the end game, because that's not how you should look at that. We look at the steps toward revolution for what they are, steps toward revolution. This is why I said generational foundational advancement, recognizing that our generations have to build foundation. Then what it does is it puts me in a proper perspective of past, present, and future, to where I know that my expectations should not be based upon everything that's going to be done in my lifetime. See, when we try to force things to all encapsulate within our lifetime, then oftentimes we spend too much time or too much energy on this quote unquote end game, and skipping all of the steps that go in between, and feeling like just because we're chasing that end game and we're moving that far, that quote unquote puts us further along in the game than other organizations, which again feeds right back into the fact that we can't synchronize ourselves on any platform because everybody is so scattered out on the battlefield. Because again, we are not recognizing the paths and the way we need to navigate that environment as a collective. This is why I said when we talk about synchronized collective action, that's where we need to be. Synchronized collective action. I say I keep coming up with those threes. This is what needs to happen. But if we don't even know what a trifactor is as individual units on the battlefield, then how can I expect us to understand synchronization? Because synchronization deals with with timing. And when we talk about timing, now we get into another trifecta. You know, so when you deal with time space gravity, which is a whole different conversation to get into at a different date. But the point being is that movement forward, movement to where we have a base camp or some means of operation may be a good move. Now, would I say that that is the ultimate move, or would I say that that is where is the end game? I think that would be the biggest mistake, is that any of us would basically define the conditions, or should I say the ends of freedom, or what freedom means, as my definition being the ultimate definition. Because now what we start doing is dividing ourselves, and I think this is where we get into egotism. I think this is where we get into uh, how it becomes easy for organizations to find themselves working apart versus opposed as working together. I think this also goes into aspects of what I call uh, I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. What I call domestication, because being domesticated, we find ourselves not knowing where to begin on the battlefield, not recognizing the fact that we need to face accountability for ourselves, for our community, for our families. And so, from that standpoint, brother, I think what you're bringing up is very important. Let's not use it. And what I need to make sure those that are listening understand is, let's not use things like that to separate us. And we also have to be real careful as an organization, or as organizers, should I say, not to reduplicate efforts for no other reason other than to reduplicate efforts. In other words, sometimes we find ourselves doing the same thing somebody else is doing within the same space and time that somebody else doing it, simply because we think we're better suited for doing it, instead of finding ways that we can collectively work together on that same platform with somebody else and do it too. Because we are allowing ourselves to become individuals over collective. And so, as an individual, especially as it applies to capitalism and imperialism, that's the name of the game. The name of the game is to make you operate like an individual. Because when you operate like an individual, then it's a dog eat dog, it's every man for himself, and so on and so forth. You get caught up in that game of cat and mouse. So we have to be able to recognize that element of ourselves as an enemy too. So that's why that can constantly go deep and deep and deep. Thank you for that, brother. Let me move on real quick. The third aspect of betrayal, manipulation, and codependency is the codependency. A codependent person will sacrifice living, sacrifice living, seek avenues of survival in order to stay in place and be what is projected on them from generational acceptance. Now, when we say stay in place, basically that means like what we would call with dealing with the lesser of two evils, is basically saying, okay, I know what to expect here, and we tend to fear what we don't understand. And so, instead of us being ready to face new challenges and new operations and new levels of gain, we find comforts in the fact that we are able to operate within a certain framework or certain realm. This is what causes us to not be able to be in harmonic balance as an individual, as a family, and as a collective. We get, again, our ego causes us to get too caught up in the fact that I am good at this one aspect, or this good at this one thing, to the point to where it becomes an imbalance within where we need to go as a people. So we end up staying in place. And then we again are dealing with the sacrifice of living as opposed to surviving. And recognize that a lot of the examples I've been trying to give you is physical examples, because once you are able to grasp a physical example, then you start thinking about, well, how can I apply that same thing on a mental plane and on a spiritual plane? So from that same standpoint, by exposing you to the the psychological ramifications or the psychological realm, it helps you to be able to ingest the methodologies that are in place and that are used against you so that we can deal with complex symbolism. So the trifactor that we just talked about, again, betrayal, manipulation, and the codependency. Any more questions before I move on from that? All right, so let's talk about what this leads us to. So from that standpoint, what we find ourselves faced with next is past trauma, which equals post-traumatic slave disorder. In other words, what we're saying is based upon past experiences and things that have happened to you, especially things that numb you, they create a post or a future position of trauma that embeds and lives with you the rest of your life because you don't go back and address how you got there. But in saying that, to an outsider, someone with a victim mentality might seem overly dramatic. But this mindset often develops in response to true victimization. It can emerge over time as a method of coping, which is what we talked about, with abuse or trauma. Facing one negative circumstance after another can make this outcome more likely. The more the chain of events, the greater the cycle of negative perception. And this is what we're getting at with this, is all of this is our perception. Not everyone who experienced traumatic stages goes on to develop a victim mentality, but people react to adversity in different ways. Emotional pain can disrupt a person's sense of control, contributing to feelings of helplessness until they feel trapped and give up. This pattern of coping draws one to be a master of getting by. And that's the key there. Is like I stated earlier, when you get good on that obstacle course, you get to a point to where you are a master of getting by. You know how to maneuver and go around it. So from that standpoint, you may actually feel like what you're doing is dealing with solutions, but you're not. You're actually just addressing the symptoms. So that's important that we see and recognize this is what's going on. Any questions? All right, let me get now into one aspect of talking about being able to deal with the identification of an enemy. And this was extracted from the Psychological Covert War on Hip Hop by Professor Griff. And I would encourage everybody, especially if you're in the position of where you're trying to reach the youth and trying to reach a younger generation, to pick up his books and watch Serious Minds, his YouTube channel. Now, with that being said, agents of influence or agent of influence. These agents can be unwitting, undermine control, or ideologically motivated to use their position of influence to sway the minds of others. Examples of agents of influence are anchormen on TV, journalists, labor leaders, TV commentators, academic quotes by the media, and some politicians. Another type of agent is a confusion agent. An agent whose job is to produce confusion by disseminating confounding information. And that's important because we see that often really one of the main things that's happening through social media. Now, a contract agent. These are the rogue agents such as the mob, who the CIA get to do their particular jobs on contract. Their connections can be denied. And that's the important thing about that, because we see all the time, or should I say we recognize after the fact, a lot of times, that certain operations or certain things happen, by way of government influence, so to speak. And they refer to it a lot of times in the legal point of view of influence, versus being able to actually say that that's the person pulling the strings, which is, again, the symbol, part of the symbolism that's on the backdrop of this document. You see the puppet string. So making sure y'all recognize that. And the whole point of there has to do with that. Now, the deep cover agent, a sleeper agent, often a program, multiple or person with mind control programming who has been a long-term sleeper agent. And what that goes into is something that we didn't necessarily cover on here, but what's called subliminal intrusive thought. Subliminal intrusive thought is when you are able to interject certain types of actions based upon things that you say, or certain exposures at a predetermined time that causes people to react a certain way later on. It's like making a concoction, like a mental pipe bomb. Let's just say it like that. But the thing about making this mental pipe bomb is I delivered the different parts of the pipe bomb at different times. It's only when the right circumstances are created in that environment. Let's say this again. When the right circumstances are created in that environment, will that pipe bomb be assembled and the fuse lit and explode. And so this happens oftentimes from a psychological standpoint, and most people are not able to identify that that is happening to them. And so that's important that we recognize this, because yeah, that is happening right now, happening all the time. Notional agent. I'm sorry, the disinformation agent. This is a highly placed agent who passes disinformation to other governments. It's kind of self-explanatory. Notional agent, a fictitious, non-existent agent which is created with a real looking identity to mislead. That is also one of the things that happens, especially through social media, when you start dealing with people that are charismatic, and the things that they providing to you, they're not giving you from an approach of application. When a person is not giving it to you something approach of how, it's like, how can I use this information? Are you just simply telling me what's wrong, what's wrong, what's wrong? Or are you sending me down this spiral of just what I call drama TV, to where I'm going to expose such and such for who they are, and then I'm going to get somebody else to come on and expose such and such, and all I do is keep pointing the fingers here, pointing fingers outward, and I'm getting you caught up into looking at these YouTube channels just like somebody is watching a soap opera. I'm not actually giving you any information. All I'm doing is sucking up one of the most valuable thing that you have in terms of your assets is time. Because when I steal your time from you by feeding you useless information and keeping you compelled to constantly take hold of this useless information, that is, again, you being stuck on a battlefield in place in that foxhole, not contributing at all to the war, not at all. And we do not need to be there. So these, again, is another example of an agent. A provocation agent, an agent sent to provoke and destabilize the target group to do foolish things. And I mean, I'm not going to be pointing out any specifics right now, but the point being, I think everybody can kind of think about, examples of this in terms of some things that they've come across, especially within the revolutionary movement. If you've been in it for a while. Spoon feeder agent, someone who dribbles out legitimate information. This is often done to build up a person's credential, bona fides. Lots of people who are pretending to expose New World Order things are spoon feeder agents who provide a little new information, tongues of already known secrets, and sprinkle in measures of disinformation for added fun. Generally, spoon feeders increase their percentage of disinformation once they gain respectability. There are very few people really exposing anything of consequence about the New World Order. And that's important, again, because see, we find sometimes when people are getting involved in the liberation movement, they find themselves also getting involved in conspiracy theories, and can start heading down this dark, long tunnel of absorbing information that may not necessarily at all be applicable to something that they can do to help liberate their people. Perfect example is when a person can get caught up in this reptilian agenda, and now we're talking about space aliens, and we're talking about um, who controls the government and all this and that, and what can you actually do if that's real right now? Where is your proof? And from that standpoint, conspiracies can constantly bombard you and prevent you from being able to actually do anything to address practical things that you can do in your community to help your people. Everything that you can do to aid people, to lessen the amount of struggle that's happening on a local level within your environment. Again, because when you talk about being on the battlefield, for everything that I can do in a localized area to help galvanize and gather my troops will ultimately lead us to be able to have larger assembly of troops. Okay. So when I'm caught up in these conspiracy theories to the point to where it renders me incapable of being able to trust people on a basic level so that we can go back to what we talked about, dealing with some type of synchronization of direct action, then I am actually being taken, basically being used by my enemy based upon these different types of agents. And so that's why we wanted to make you aware of this so that you can think about the personality types and think about some of the things that you're being exposed to in the way they're being exposed to you. Because again, it's about practicality. Any questions before we move on or comments? Somebody.
I just want to thank you. Thank you, brother, for all this.
No problem. Appreciate it. The bottom line is if the stuff that we're going over needs to be put into use by all of us, and then some. That's the whole point. Because if people are just on here to soak up information but not apply that information and not apply it to helping others be able to free themselves from the conditions of crystallization, then it's not doing any good. So that's the point here. The stuff that we're going over is for you to put into practice on the different levels of trifactor. Now this is something, now we're going to start covering something a little bit deeper. If you already thought we went deep, just from the standpoint of recognizing how the enemy can hide itself. And this is the straw man. There are different factors or different levels within straw man, but we're only going to talk about one specifically right now. A straw man is a form of argument and a informal fallacy of having the impression of refuting an argument, whereas the real subject of the argument was not addressed or refuted, but instead replaced with a false one. A common form of setting up such a straw man is by use of a notorious formula. So what you're saying is converting the argument to be challenged into an obvious obscured distortion. One who engages in this fallacy is said to be attacking a straw man. A typical straw man argument creates an illusion of having refuted or defeated an opponent proposition through the convert replacement of it with different propositions. Stand up a straw man, and the subsequent refutation of that false argument, knocking down a straw man instead of the opponent's proposition. Now, with that being said, a typical straw man verbal attack would be, and these are this is just like we're doing a play here. So Clarence, taking a shower is beneficial. And Donald said, but hot water may damage your skin. Now, Donald's attack on non-existent argument, taking an extremely hot shower is beneficial. And because such an argument is obviously false, Clarence might start believing that he is wrong because of what Donald is saying was clearly true. But his real argument was not disproved, but he did not say anything about the temperature. So in essence, what we're explaining here is how manipulation can be used based upon general word conversation or general conversation with somebody. This is like when we was earlier talking about, well, if you're on a battlefield and you're talking with someone, be aware of the things that are being stated to you and be able to recognize when you're being manipulated or when someone is manipulating the situation. Because oftentimes straw men are erected and placed up through conversational means unconsciously. When we are as a victim, let's go back to what we talked about before. When we live a lifestyle as a victim, then we get good at drama. We get good at operating on that level. And when we operate on a dramatic point of view or perspective, we unconsciously engage in general conversations through attack. And so oftentimes we may not even be recognizing that our general conversation is a negative conversation, that we're negatively approaching something that someone is trying to bring us, not even realizing that what we're doing is we're diffusing growth. And so this is what's happening at that point. So we have to be able to see and identify with what a straw man is. Give me just a second here. All right. So I'm back here. So in regards to a straw man, it's important that you are aware of this taking place, because when we talk about being on the battlefield, if we don't see that discussion, that conversation actually sets us up for failure, sets us up for victimization, then we are not able to really identify a problem for what it is. But instead, we find ourselves chasing symptoms and addressing symptoms after symptoms after symptoms. And so that is not going to lead us to any position of being able to deal with liberation at any level. I'm going to skip that one real quick, but I want to talk about this here. Power respects power. So ignorance of the law does not protect you from the judgment. So in saying that, protects you from the judgment, now let's talk about legal fiction and fiction of the law, because this is important, because when we talk about legal fiction and fiction of the law, these are two concepts that most people are not aware of. So let's talk about define now what legal fiction is. And remember, earlier we talked about define, develop, and then defend. If you don't have a true definition of a situation, then you're not able to develop any ability to be able to adjust and address it. Therefore, you can't defend yourself against it. So defined, legal fiction, assumption of a fact made by court as basis for deciding a legal question, a situation contrived by law to permit a court to dispose of a matter. A legal fiction typically allows for the court to ignore a fact that would prevent it from exercising its jurisdiction, simply assuming that the fact is different. In cases where the court must determine whether a standard has been reached, such as whether a defendant has been negligent, the court frequently uses legal fiction of the reasonable man. In law, reasonable man or reasonable person is a hypothetical person of legal fiction crafted by the courts and communicated through case law and jury instructions. Now, what's important about legal fiction is we find this tactic always and oftentimes really being used against us collectively as it applies to how law is applied in the court system. And most of us don't realize that that's what's happening, is that they're creating this fictitious example of a situation and applying that to your circumstance in order to convict you of a crime. And so this is how we find ourselves put back right back in conditions of slavery, based upon how the Constitution is written, based upon legal fiction. Now, fiction of the law, let's go into what fiction of the law is defined. An assumption that a certain thing is true, and which gives to a person or thing a quality which is not natural to it, and consequently establish a certain disposition which without the fiction would be reprudent to reason and to truth. It is an order of things which does not exist, but which the law prescribes or authorizes. It's different from presumption because it establishes as true something which is false, whereas presumption supplies truth of something true, proof of something that is true. And the law never fakes what is impossible, right? So fiction is like art, and imitates nature, but never disfigures it. It aids truth, but ought never to destroy it. It may well suppose that what was possible, but which is not existent, does not exist, but would never fringe that which is impossible actually is. And I know all that's kind of sound weird on wordplay, but I at the bottom here, at the very end of this document, I did give references to for you to further go into what these things that we're defining here. And what's important about fiction of the law is that, again, what they tend to do is they create something that is not even true, and they define it as truth. So they create a fiction law, basically a fiction of the law, in order to convict you of something, or in order to create a situation and fit you in as that mold. And it is important that we realize and recognize this because, again, as being on the battlefield and dealing with legal fiction and fiction of the law, these are two weapons from a polarity standpoint that are used against the population all the time. And when politicians play these games like that, and your ignorance of the law causes you to not know what the hell is really being said to you, then you find yourself behind bars, or you find yourself basically incarcerated based upon things that don't even really make sense in the first place. And in saying that, fictions were invented by Roman magistrates who, not possessing the power to repel a law, were nevertheless willing to deteriorate from it under the pretense of doing equity. Fiction is the resource of weakness, which, in order to obtain its objectives, assume as a fact what is known to be contrary to truth. When this legislator desires to accomplish his objective, he needs not simulate, he commands. And so that's why they're also above you on the court and at the bench. Fictions of law owe their origin to the legislative place of the bench. So now, in saying that, let's talk about something else that kind of connects to what we're talking about, which is human genetic variation. Is a genetic difference in and among populations. There may be multiple variants of any given gene in the human population, a situation called polymorphism. The lack of discontinuities and genetic distances between human population, absence of discrete branches in the human species, and striking homogeneity of human beings globally shows that there is no scientific basis for inferring races or subspecies in humans. And for most traits, there is much of variation within populations than between them. Despite this, modern genetic studies have found substantial average genetic differences across human populations in traits such as skin color, body dimensions, lactose and starch digestion, high altitude adaptations, and predispositions to develop particular diseases. And saying all of that, the greatest diversity is found among populations in Africa and gradually decline with increasing distance from the African continent. And that's important to recognize that, because when we're talking about dealing with the weaponization of what's happening collectively across the board with humanity, most people are not aware of the most genetic variation actually exists within Africa. So when we see ourselves being pinned against each other, and you see the African continent being carved up the way it is, and you see people being pushed toward individualism the way they are, and this current fight and current trend that's happening now, in terms of a quote unquote universal identity feeds into the weaponization that coincides with what's called black identity extremism or black identity. So universal identity goes against black identity. Black identity is at that point, based upon fiction of the law, is characterized as terrorism. So if you're not engaged and involved in how a population can come together to the whole point of where it doesn't matter what race you are, what sex you are, and how you view those things, to the position of being able to create what they call a universal identity, which means that you can identify with anything that you feel like as opposed to what natural law is. It creates a condition of confusion within the given population that allows them to fully express individuality over collective development. And by taking that to its extreme position, collective development will naturally deteriorate because we are in full expression of our individual identities. And that's one of the biggest traps that we find taking place, especially with our younger generations. Any question about what we just talked about before I move forward? Because we're getting close to the last section of what I want to go over. Somebody at least give me an acknowledgement so I know I ain't talking to myself.
We're here, Brother War.
Thank you.
Most definitely. You like them.
All right. All right. And this section here is extracted from the ISIS Papers by Francis Cress Wilson. Now, what's important about this is now what we're talking about here is dealing with aspects of symbology. So the process of decoding a power system and its culture is necessary first steps to achieve behavior mastery over that system of culture. The attainment of such mastery is an essential step to the process of total liberation for victims who wish to end the oppression and regain their self-respect and their mental health. And that's important because now we're talking about how these things that we're addressing here in terms of high complex symbology are able to be applied so that we can come together better and being able to identify this stuff here. So without this process of decoding, the oppressed fail to fully understand what they are dealing with. They have minimum levels of consciousness and self/group respect, and they are functionally speaking mentally ill. And this is why I say what we're talking about at that point is dealing with levels of dysfunctionality as a population. And when we're dysfunctional as a population and we come together to build something, then we're bringing what we call baggage to the table. And for all of the baggage that we bring to the table, those things have to be unpacked as we move forward. So with them not being unpacked properly as we move forward, then we continue to inject dysfunctionality into future generations, which naturally causes them to destroy or refute what has been built before. And we oftentimes don't understand why that's happening to us. But this helps us to see what's actually going on. This decoding activity entails the unraveling and analysis of all various products of individual and collective brain activity within a given culture. These brain products appear and are reflected in all areas of human activity, whether it be economics, education, entertainment, including games and sports, labor, law, politics, religion, sex, and war. This analysis of products and of conscious as well as unconscious brain activity patterns of logic, thought, speech, action, emotion response, perception, dream, symbol, and intuition would be required. Of special importance are the brain products that issue forth from those who are white and who presently control the power balance in the global power system of white supremacy, and who thus produce the dominant themes and trends within a system and a cultural framework. Symbols are highly abstract, condensed, and coded messages that are developed by the activity of brain computers in a human organism. These messages are developed and evolved from energy sensory data received in the brain from the external environment. This is why we talked about that earlier in terms of recognizing those trifactors. Various lines of energy data form the total environment coverage on the brain computer via the nervous system, which is why we talked about the neural nets needing to be connected, which can then, under the proper circumstance, lead to the development of a symbol. And that's what we need to realize, because when you put that perpetual motion or that perpetual that weapon in motion on one generation, it causes that generation to enhance the symbology to the next generation, and they continue to build upon something that was already on their demise. So that's why it's important to see that as a symbol. Thus, symbols reflect certain aspects of external environment and the total body's internal environmental response to external environments. There are other kinds of symbols that are not as immediately translated or fully understood because of their highly abstract forms and complexity. The impact of these complex symbols reach subconscious and unconscious levels of brain activity. These complex symbols are in effect full sentences or paragraphs or entire books of data stated in highly abstract single images of line configuration, which goes back into the symbol that you see on the page, on each one of these pages with the puppet master. Once the symbol is formed, it is capable of acting upon brain computer, which receives it as an energy or data message. This message affects the end product of behavior as carried forth by the area of human activity. The symbol in terms acts upon the external environment. These single picture sentences or single picture paragraphs commence in the brain computer and act as a powerful, undetected persuader, and thus a powerful determinants of behavioral patterns. These complex symbols are usually related to the deepest cultural themes of a people and have significant messages to convey about the people's and culture's reason for being. Furthermore, these reasons are passed on uncensored in the unconscious via the total environmental experience. See, we keep talking about the environment, why that's important. From the beginning of a people's time, generation to generation. This is why I talked about the collective coupling of the past, present, and future. In this manner, the symbols act as a stringing rod that irrigates the unconscious, sending out energy responses in the form of thought, speech, action, and emotions. And wrapping this up here, the major forms of symbols in the power system culture constitute powerful and subliminal messages that about how and why the culture came into being and what the people must do to survive and maintain itself, which is how history continued to rewrite itself based upon those that are in control. A genuine symbol is an image which possesses two essential features. One, it originates within the archetype ground of the psyche. Number two, there exists a consciousness to comprehend it. A word or an image is symbolic when it implies something more than its obvious and immediate meaning. As the mind explores a symbol, it is led to ideas that lie, see how that happens here, lie beneath the grasp of reason. Examples used in subliminal weaponization: the Western image of a Jesus Christ, a combination of words like chicken and watermelon, a game of pool where the rules of the white ball and the black ball, the statement or phrases of black male and the association to a black male. With the above in mind, some of the sensory data is coded at a level of consciousness, but because of the large scope of unattended perceptions, much of the data is coded at the unconscious level of brain activity. This data is dispersed between the left and the right cerebral hemispheres, respectively. Within the framework of a given system and culture, certain perceptions may exist that are not acknowledged overtly, and certain ideas, thoughts, concepts, and theories that are utterly rarely, if ever. These perceptions, words, ideas, concepts, and theories that are repressed or channeled into the unconscious level of the brain computer becomes an entire world of ideas treated as though they never existed in the form of concrete reality. thus lost in time, which is why we talked again about past, present, and future, and leading to a denial of opinion and further use to promote the psychological abuse implemented between social hierarchy. And a lot of what I said earlier before we got into this extract from the ISIS papers was really just leading up to what she was getting at in the ISIS papers. And for those of y'all that have, hopefully a lot of y'all read the ISIS papers, but what I basically in essence did was break down and give you a background to be able to absorb a lot of what she just said in that particular chapter. Do anybody got any questions now in regards to what we talked about before we close out? And the last page, all I got now is basically a couple of quotes here. Lying to ourselves is more deeply ingrained than lying to others. For the professional deceiver, musicians, spies, confidence men, the problem is not the moral rectitude, but rather the social comprehension. He or she must understand the seen but unnoticed features of everyday life. Every human being is a problem in search of a solution. And then from that, I got references that you can click on that'll take you to some of the stuff we talked about. And then also at the very bottom here, a link to the Panther 48 channel where you can see previous political education classes and topics that we've discussed. Anybody got any questions before we close out on what we talked about?
Brother War, I don't have any questions, but I will say that I have been totally fed. And I thank you. All power to the people.
I appreciate you, brother. All power to the people. Anybody else? All right, again, just if you hadn't already and you do want a copy of this document, just put your email in the chat before we close out. So I give everybody a quick second to do so. And then from there, I appreciate you everyone for attending and look forward to us, collectively building with one another and moving ourselves closer toward addressing our dysfunctionalities as a people so that we can truly work toward revolution in whatever that looks like as it applies to our development, as well as dealing with what we need to do to bring humanity in general to a better position. Because I'm pretty sure everybody's aware of what's happening through climate change. This climate change is a direct consequence of a lot of the things that as humans, what we are doing to the climate. So by us not doing the right thing as a human population for the sake of the planet itself is going to harvest itself of or rid itself of the things that are that are operating like viruses and destroying it. So for the sake of natural law and for the sake of order and for the sake of survival of humanity, we owe it to ourselves to be involved and get involved in making a change from in fighting imperialism as it applies to how we deplete natural resources as humans and how the how resources are basically not being disseminated and dispersed equally across the board. So no matter how or what angle you want to see the Black liberation struggle from, recognize that if we continue to emulate and take advantage of the planet the way we are dooming ourselves in future generations from being able to enjoy the planet and be able to cohabitate and be in existence. So be involved if for no other reason to save humanity from itself. And so with that being said, people, I just like to say all power to the people. Thank everyone for attending.